Now, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has urged member states to provide more ammunition and air defenses to Ukraine to change the trajectory of the war with Russia. He said it was necessary for Ukraine to go from being on the back foot, as he termed it, to a position of strength before peace talks with Russia could be considered.
The front is not moving eastwards, it is slowly moving westwards. So we have to make sure that Ukraine gets into a position of strength, and then it should be the Ukrainian government to decide on the next steps in terms of opening peace talks and how to conduct them. I would argue, let's not have all these discussions step by step on what a peace process might look like. Make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to get to a position of strength when those peace talks start, when the Ukrainian government has decided they are ready to do so. Whenever we get to a deal on Ukraine, it has to be a good deal. Because what we can never have is high-fiving Kim Jong-uns and Xi Jinping and whoever else thinking that it is a bad deal. Because that might get other people think about what they could do. So this is crucial for our defense, not only here in Europe, but also the US, the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic.
And that is Mark Rutte, who is the Secretary General of NATO there. Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line from London by the European Affairs analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz. Great to see you, Dr. Laskiewicz. So, is the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, making a big new push for Ukraine, and is he on his own?
I'm afraid it is perhaps in his eyes a big push. We've heard it all before, and as far as one can see, it's just yet another platitude mentioned by the West. The most important point is what arms are going to Ukraine, and all this speechifying really gets us nowhere. I'm afraid his comments are therefore of very limited interest. Far more interesting is what Trump is planning.
Well, we're going to get to what Trump is planning, and I agree with you. That usually is much more interesting. But I mean, all this talk about Ukraine being on an irreversible path to NATO membership, but the process never seems to officially get started. I mean, well, what's going on there?
Well, the central problem is that there's a lot of, as I say, speechifying by politicians who are talking about Ukraine and helping Ukraine, but when it comes down to ground level, to actually doing something, as you rightly point out, nothing is happening. The central problem with Ukraine's bid for membership is that technically it can't happen because one of the points about being in NATO, or joining NATO to be more accurate, is your frontier should not be in dispute, whereas of course Ukraine's are. And this problem has bedeviled the whole of Ukraine's bid for membership for years now. And to that extent, nothing much has been solved. What is clear is that there's a lot of talk, but in terms of action, nothing. So there'll be neither more arms, as far as one can see, in substantial terms for Ukraine, nor any move to NATO either.
And I mean, you mentioned Donald Trump earlier. Has his imminent arrival on the political scene, does it have anything to do with this sort of cosmetic flurry of activity, if I might call it that?
It is indeed cosmetic. And the key point is that Donald Trump has made it quite clear that he's going to solve the war. And now they're sending out a trial balloon. And the trial balloon is quite clear. Ukraine has to cede territory, and there's no way it's going to be allowed into NATO. In other words, as Donald Trump sees it, he is going to see that Putin signs the agreement because his interest, let's say Putin's interest and Russia's interest, will remain paramount. This is, of course, in direct contradiction to what NATO was saying just a few minutes ago. But in terms of who is important, Donald Trump, alas, trumps NATO.
And I mean, I saw a note from you earlier suggesting that Mr. Trump's plan is being unofficially trialed, and that, well, I mean, you've made it clear Ukraine isn't getting into NATO anytime soon, and there's also a suggestion that it's losing territory. Can you kind of connect the dots there for us?
Yes, Donald Trump sees it like this. In order to stop the war, two things must be recognized. Clearly, Russia has interests, and he's seen those interests, and that's why Ukraine, as far as Donald Trump is concerned, won't get into NATO, because Putin has made it quite clear that is a sine qua non. Number two, it is quite clear that Ukraine cannot win the war in terms of recovering its former territory, and therefore Donald Trump is quite prepared to see Ukraine cede territory, therefore resulting in peace. This is, of course, diametrically opposite to what President Zelensky was saying. It's also opposite to what many Europeans are saying, including, as we just heard, the NATO head. And therefore, what is happening here is Donald Trump is now trialing, and he's seeing what's going to happen in terms of what people are saying. And as it stands, the most significant move in that respect was made by President Zelensky, who suddenly has backed down from saying that he wants to recover all Ukraine's territory and is starting to think in terms of a more realistic peace proposal. Quite what all this means is going to be unclear until Donald Trump takes office, but it is entirely clear that it's not going to be anything like Western Europe and President Zelensky hoped for.
Nevertheless, President Zelensky insists that the only way that Ukraine can have its security guaranteed is for it to become a full member of NATO. I mean, he does have a point, doesn't he?
Oh, yes, he does. One of the key problems is that if a peace is signed, how do we know Russia won't break it in a year's time, say? The Polish-Russian history is instructive in this sense. Poland and Russia have signed 19 peace treaties, 3 of them internal, and all of them, including the eternal ones, have been broken by Russia. So therefore, he is quite right. But the problem is Putin will not accept this. And the question is, which way will Trump go? As it stands, it seems that he's going to go along with what Russia wants and not what Ukraine wants. What Zelensky has, however, said that he has prepared to be more realistic about what he wants in terms of, I think, the territory, but he's quite correct about NATO. If he's not in NATO, Russia can attack again.
And, I mean, beyond the sort of the politics of all of this, what's your sense of what's going on in the battlefield?
The battlefield is, as has been actually mentioned in your program by the NATO head, slowly but surely Russia is advancing westwards. As she advances westwards, there are 3 corollaries. 1, there's no obvious reason why Putin has to sign a peace treaty at all. 2, as she advances westwards, the Ukrainian side is slowly losing heart. The level of desertions has gone up. This has come out quite recently, in figures. And in that sense, there's a problem that Ukraine possibly may no longer feel like resisting to the extent it did before. Number 3, it kind of now hinges on what's happening in the Kursk region, because if Ukraine can hold on to that, it would imply that there's still life in it, that she's willing to fight. If, on the other hand, they lose Kursk region, which was supposed to be a war winner, then I suspect that Ukraine will indeed agree to unfavorable peace terms.
That is very interesting indeed. Lots of moving parts and perhaps unmoving parts there. Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, we appreciate your analysis more than you will ever know. Thank you ever so much. The European Affairs Analyst, Dr. Marek Laskiewicz, talking to me there on the line from London.